Um, okay, let's get more a bit back to more kind of like domestic issues because I think people want to understand this because there is a domestic issue. There's been a lot more talk of recession. Again, I've seen it more in the UK press recently because I've been back in the UK. Um, the As I understand it, the definition of a recession is it 2 quarters of negative growth or is it 2 months? I can't remember.
There are a couple different definitions.
Yeah,
One of them is 2 negative quarters.
yeah,
Another one is generally just a contraction in economic activity over a prolonged period of time. So um, there's different organizations in different areas that are kind of responsible for like calling a recession. The thing is, they don't call it till hindsight, right? They don't say, okay, we're entering a recession in real time. Often they'll, months later, they'll go back and say, oh, that's when the recession started, right? And
Right.
so generally the 2 quarters is like the one that's referenced the most, but there's no official global definition of a recession.
But generally speaking, it is a drop on economic output, and we see that with the UK. We have a real cost of living crisis at the moment. I think 20% of the population is in fuel poverty, which means they cannot afford to pay their fuel bills. We know there's a massive increase in costs in shopping. I mean, I saw one thing that the budget pastas are now up 50% in price, but there's a massive increase, 10, 15% on a wide range of things that's really hurting people's ability to feed their children. We see stories of families skipping meals. There's all these different stories of things that people are doing. Even the radio shows or the TV shows and newspapers are running articles about how to survive a cost of living crisis, how to manage your budget. But this cost of living crisis, I guess, the impact of this is people have less money to spend on other things. So there will be a downstream effect on maybe retail environments or people going to concerts or all these things, which this is what leads to a recession.
Yeah, well, there's multiple ways you can get to a recession.
Yeah.
And one of them is certainly when energy and commodity prices take up a increasing proportion of the economy. Because basically mandatory spending pushes away, as you described, discretionary spending. And so, humans are happier and more flourishing when you have to spend a very little amount of your money on, the necessities of life, and you can spend more on your on travel and luxuries and optionality. But when those necessities increase in cost for one reason or another, that is a common trigger for a recession. Another one is that just the central banks and the fiscal force are trying to push back on inflation. As I described, they can't just create more oil fields, but so what they can try to do is reduce demand for things. So they can kind of, in their vision, the best is to have like a very mild recession. But it's, they call it a soft landing.
How do they do that though?
Well, historically they don't, right? It's one of those things, they always want a soft landing and then they don't get a soft landing and then they get a hard landing and then they have to reverse course. It's very unusual. It's rather unusual to get a soft landing. I mean, technically, for example, in the 2000s, after the dot-com bubble, in the US at least, you had a relatively soft recession. It wasn't a particularly severe one, but that was a very different cause. And so there are recessions that are worse than others. So they're not delusional in thinking that, not everything is like a giant crisis, but, it's one of those things where like analyst Luke Groman would say, we no longer have a dial, we have like an off and on switch, and they still think it's a dial. But because there's so much debt in the system, that dial starts to become like a switch. It's you're either growing or you're kind of collapsing because there's just so much debt that if you're not growing, you're falling apart pretty quickly.
But how do they centrally drive a reduction in demand?
So one thing that they can do is they can tighten monetary policy to make it harder to get a loan.
Oh, okay.
So they can slow down housing activity, and that's a big factor for a lot of economies. And then especially like junk debt has harder getting financing. And then they can also combine that with the fiscal side, can stop doing stimulus, things like that. They could raise taxes, which they're not doing because that's politically unpopular, but when they're not sending out stimulus checks, many cases right now.
Well, they're talking about that in the UK in one way. So the energy bills we talked about this previously. I saw a massive increase, like a nearly 300% increase in my energy bills. And it's a material difference. You see it in the bills, and you see and you extrapolate that out for the year and realize how much you're going to spend on gas and electric. I'm fortunate enough to be able to cover that, but I know there's other people who are less fortunate. And so the government recently, Danny, can you just double check this? But I think they're talking about sending out, I don't think it's in the checks out. Everybody in the country, they're going to offer something like £400 off their energy bills in October or something like that.
£400 energy bill discount in October.
Yeah, so I was trying to work this out in my head because it says every household in the country?
Every household, yeah.
So I was thinking, well, first of all, I don't need this. So why do this? And maybe half the country doesn't need this. But is the cost of trying to means test it too expensive?
Well, it also says that people on benefits get an additional £650.
Okay. But there's those on benefits, and it depends which benefits I guess they're on. But what I'm saying is I do not need this. And I know a lot of people who don't need this. So what that means is they could they have two other options. They could, for some people, maybe do it for 2 months, or for some, or just the cost of doing this is lower to the government. There's another point I'm going to come to on windfall taxes. But so I was trying to think about it like that. And I was also trying to think, well, why £400 discount in October? Because really, most people, it's about £100 a month might make that big difference if they're controlling it. Why just do it as a lump in 1 month?
Is it because it's getting colder, so energy prices will go up?
Yeah, but I don't think some people's energy bills are going to go up £400. Mm-hmm. But even if it is, what about October? What about November? What about December? What about January? What about February? They're all cold months in the UK, every single one of them. So I didn't understand 1 month. Does it say how much the cost it is there?
For the entire program? I'll have a look.
I mean, this is essentially a stimulus check of sorts.
Broadly speaking, I think we're going to see that quite a bit this decade.
Right.
We've already seen it, as you point out, in Europe and some places. And I think we're going to see it more broadly where the stimulus checks we saw before were like these broad ones, where you could literally take your check and buy Dogecoin with it. Which I don't recommend, but people did. Right. And I think the types of stimulus we're going to see going forward is energy and food subsidies. And so that can alleviate the hardship for the people that need it the most. But it also does contribute to ongoing stagflation and currency devaluation, right? So at the end of the day, the key thing they have to do is figure out how to get more energy and more commodities supply to come online. And these other attempts, I think, because of how much debt's in the system, they basically just can't let just recessions happen for prolonged periods of time. Like if you look at every recession, there's always these stimulus effects, and then in a healthy environment, like let's say you had a low debt system, recessions can just kind of work themselves out, right? You eventually clear out the malinvestment, and then the cycle starts anew with capital. Enterprising individuals come in with their capital, and they kickstart the next investment cycle, the next consumption cycle. But because there's so much debt in the system, it's like the way I would describe it is like if you have this meticulously garden that you've elaborately designed. If you let that go, it starts to unravel pretty quickly. It's not just like a healthy, balanced forest, for example.
Sounds like my garden.
So our economy is like this meticulous garden that if they stop interfering with it, it starts to get messy pretty quickly. And so I think we're going to see some level of economic deceleration or outright recessions. And then we're probably going to see some increasing usage of these kind of targeted stimulus for kind of things that people have no choice but to spend on.
And then how is that financed? If it's financed by printing more money, we increase the money supply, which drives inflation, which